Hello and welcome to episode 5, to our listeners and to my co-host, Rob Pierce. It has definitely been a wild ride in the last 5 weeks, doing 5 episodes, one a week. And I'm surprised not only by our ability to do it, but also by the uptake. Our Instagram account has grown exponentially, and I also feel quite old for a youngster, feeling out of touch with Instagram and why we even need an Instagram account. But also our LinkedIn has really blown up as well. It's really been an interesting few weeks in the growth of the Learning Zone podcast, I must say.
For sure, Rob. It's quite fun and interesting in the sense that we trialing new things, trying to do things a bit differently than what we've done in the past. And as you can see now, for those of you who listen to us over YouTube and prefer the video format of our podcast, we've got some new podcasting mics, which are quite fun. And whilst we're recording this, we're still getting accustomed to using the different forms of technology. StreamYard, while this is going live, we're also trying to figure out how we record the audio separately versus the actual video streaming piece too. So all new, all exciting, and we're hoping that the first 4 episodes were insightful and gave you some food for thought, and that you're starting to apply some of those habits.
Definitely. And I think what's been so interesting is actually the learning that we've had in actually making a podcast. Neither of us are podcast experts. We're podcast listeners, that's for sure. We are not technology experts. We're not social media experts, maybe social media consumers, if that can be an expert level. And unfortunately, I must out my co-host at this point to also say he does have the technology age of a 50-year-old. So that has been an interesting dynamic of getting this right in our partnership. Luckily, he brings a lot more to the table besides his difficulty with technology. But besides that, it has been a wild ride and a lot of learning on many fronts.
Maybe based on our topic today, which we'll get into, that could be a bias on your end, Rob. I'd attest to the fact that I think I've improved dramatically with technology, but as we say, there's always room for improvement, and with effort, focus, and some curiosity, maybe you can lend a helping hand and get me to where I need to be. Thank goodness you're running all of this, and StreamYard's being recorded seamlessly, and you've done all the editing and formatting, and we'll take it from there.
Definitely, Rob. I'm only joking, and it's definitely been a part of the fun and part of the banter as well. Technology can be frustrating at times, but it also can be a real blessing when you get it right. And as I say that, Rob may have the technology competence of a 50-year-old. That's definitely a stereotype, perhaps a bias. And that, funnily enough, is actually what we want to talk about today. We really want to dig into the topic of bias and what that really means and why it's so important. Rob, before we get into some of the science, some of the practical experience, some of the stuff that we bring in the Learning Zone, why should we care about bias? Why is it so important?
Bias is hugely important. I think we've been fortunate enough, obviously, to work for the Neuroleadership Institute Africa, and we're exposed to the latest research around what happens in the brain when it makes decisions. And we ourselves have been found wanting in so many ways in the way that we make decisions. And, we often laugh at each other around how biased certain decisions are that we've made. And it's interesting is that, we're making in excess of 20,000 decisions a day, some obviously much more important than others, some more lower stakes than others. But typically, those decisions have either positive impact or adverse impact on the things that we make decisions on. So decision making is vitally important. And I think in this tumultuous world that we're living in, that the decisions that are made now within organizations, that individuals make, and that you make within teams can have long-standing impact in what you do going forward. So, really, we want to talk about bias because we are unconsciously making thousands of decisions a day. And are those decisions serving us as we would like, or are they in our best interests?
Rob, as you're saying that, I'm dying to ask you on the spot, What was the most significant decision you made today, and what was the most insignificant?
Sure. So that's putting me on the spot. The most significant decision I made today was the recruitment and selection potentially of someone who could help grow our search engine optimization on our website. And that's a critical part of the growth of our business. And we obviously wanted someone who has deep-rooted expertise and can get us to the level we'd like as quickly as possible. But the most unimportant or really trivial decision I made was probably what I was going to eat for lunch. And I don't know, or even maybe this morning was probably what I was going to wear, because in this virtual world of facilitation and this virtual world of delivery that we work in, I'm pretty much wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and maybe a collared shirt or blazer if I'm delivering work to a client. But those are pretty trivial, I would say, in the broader scheme of things.
And there's definitely not just a handful. There's even more that we go through on a daily basis, some more important than others. For those that are on the YouTube channel right now, you will be noticing that I'm wearing a vintage Liverpool jersey. So that was my choice today. But I must be honest, I was a lot less mindful of that choice versus a bigger choice like recruiting and selecting a vendor. And I think that's really at the heart of the challenge around bias, because bias affects decisions that are made consciously and unconsciously. And the biggest thing about decision making is that we have a limited capacity to make decisions in a day. That's why our brain actually hardwires our decision making to free up our cognitive capacity for the things that matter, making the big decisions. So the small decisions, we're not even mindful of them. We're not even wasting our limited cognitive capacity on them. That's also why some greats like Mark Zuckerberg and Barack Obama only have 2 outfit choices in their wardrobe at any one time. They don't want to waste complex decision-making power, which they know is finite, on choosing what to wear. They'd rather reserve that decision-making on, which country to send a nuke to, or which social media platform to buy up. And that's really a big part of how bias works. So we understand now that decision-making is finite, our capacity to make decisions. We make thousands a day. So where does bias fall in? Well, bias, understood from a scientific perspective, is a mental shortcut that helps us to make decisions. It's largely unconscious and it's helpful. It helps divert precious cognitive capacity into making decisions unconsciously so that our limited capacity can go to the decisions that matter. And if you think about some of the decisions you've made today, what you ate, what you chose to wear, if you were going to decide, should I drive to work, should I walk to work, and that's also if you're walking to your bedroom or not, whether you are standing or sitting. And for those of you that are listening to the podcast now, are you really conscious of what you're doing right now, or are you unconsciously just going through the motions? That's an example of how bias is managing our cognitive capacity. It's the reason why you can talk on the phone while you're driving. And it's also the reason why you can listen to a webinar or this podcast while attending to your emails. Bias is what helps us create mental shortcuts for cognitive capacity, and it's helpful, except when it's not.
It's brilliant, Rob. I love the scientific angle into bias, and the fact that I think you mentioned it, that biases are quite a misnomer and an anomaly, because biases actually, when we think about them, we further hardwire them. They become ingrained and entrenched in those neural pathways that we speak of. But you've spoken a lot around, what neuroscientists and neurologists speak around, which is the heuristics, which I find quite fascinating in many ways, because heuristics is basically a mental shortcut that allows people to solve problems and make judgments quickly and efficiently. And we mentioned in a previous episode that our brain has 2 major functions. One is to keep us safe and alive and mitigate the threats in our immediate context. And the second is to manage the cognitive load that plays out. And so 80 to 90% of the time, we're functioning essentially on autopilot, and our brain's trying to set up and create space for what it deems are more important decisions. And as you just said, which is so great, is that You need to be conscious of catching yourself when you could be making a decision that has far-reaching implications.
And I think that's so important, because we've essentially put that if you have a brain, you have bias. And I think that's a very important distinction to make in the wider field of this topic, because we often say that we have a bias towards bias. No one who assumes themselves to be a good person would say that they are, biased, right? Because bias means that you're, has connotations like discrimination and harassment and all these things that make headlines. But understanding bias from a scientific perspective really changes the script on that. It really brings home the point that bias serves us. It helps us conserve cognitive capacity, and it helps us, for example, when choosing a place to have lunch. I know that you chose your lunch today from a certain place. I have a huge bias towards Mexican food and a preference for that, and I'll let that be known. And it's okay if I sway a decision towards that. However, if I have a bias towards choosing, let's say, to your example of the SEO vendor for search engine optimization, and happens to be my brother's best friend, and it's his first gig out of varsity, maybe being biased towards that or favoring that mental shortcut would have some bad consequences. And that's really the point around bias, is to understand you can't eliminate it. It's a biological functioning of the brain that helps you make decisions, but it can get in the way of the big ones. And the first step in bias is to realize which decisions are the big ones, and is bias playing out?
Yeah, but it's an interesting piece, Rob, in so many ways. But maybe when we talk about the science of bias, we should talk about the amount of biases that can play out. One thing that I've always found fascinating with our work in the Neuroleadership Institute is that there are over 150 classifications of bias, and we can't consciously catch ourselves being biased. So we go through the day making decisions and not really thinking through what this actually means. Like, if I make this decision because I'm looking at a certain outcome, what could I do to make sure that my decisions are optimal? And particularly in business, not just the people decisions, but decisions that impact business outcomes. And, when we work with a number of our organizations that we've partnered with, a number of decisions that have, been evaluated and scrutinized, when they look back on them, they go, how did that decision ever come about? And it's great to have hindsight and to look at it reflexively. But more often than not, many organizations talk about the regret around some of those big decisions they made. And when we talk about how they could overcome those instances and be aware of the biases playing out when they get to those outcomes or those decisions, they go, oh, it sounds so obvious now, but we were just moving swiftly ahead to get to what was then a priority.
It's such a great example, because I think there's that saying, hindsight is 20/20. Yeah. I'm not sure exactly of the explanation of that, but 20/20 vision is perfect vision. So I guess looking back, you always have perfect vision, right? You can, there's no blind spots, should we say. There's no blind spots when we look backwards. And wouldn't you rather that be the case every time you make a decision, rather than looking back and spotting the blind spots? And that's really why bias has become at the forefront of a lot of corporate leaders right now, entrepreneurs, and people that want to make better decisions every day to unlock human potential. And that's really what we're doing in this podcast, and what the Learning Zone is about, is to create that space to start practicing spotting bias in decision making, and spotting it perhaps in what you choose to wear, where you choose to go to lunch. And when you start getting into that practice of experimentation, of spotting bias in yourself and others, you'll be able to identify it when it matters and when you need it most. So at this point, we've understood that bias is not a word to be scared of, to be taboo of. If you have a brain, you have bias. The work we've done with the Neuroleadership Institute has really brought that home for a lot of our corporate clients. And it's also a reason why people love the work that we do. When we do unconscious bias training, almost every delegate of many sessions have said, it's the first bias training I do where I don't feel bad walking out of it. I kind of understand better that computer between the ears, and I know what to do about it. I know which mental shortcuts are helpful and which are getting in the way. And the next part of that equation is to understand which ones are playing out where. In the time that we have in this forum as well, we shoot these episodes in one take. We don't have the time to get into all 150 or even the 5 broad categories that the Neuro Leadership Institute has identified. But we can talk about some examples that I think a lot of people can relate to right now in this context.
Great, Rob. And I would love to share some stories, because I think, you know, when we think about what's happened over the last year and the fact that we've been so performance driven and outcome focused around making sure that we can get through and weather the storm and our business can come out the other side better for it. But what that's lent itself to is being very execution and task focused and delivering on the essential things. And I think by inference then, we are making more biased decisions and trying to be expedient in making decisions. So, you know, for me, you know, I'm quite an A-type individual. If I have 10 tasks, I come into your office and say, what are you prioritizing? I've got to do these 10 things. How do we morph the things we've got to do together and get them down the, you know,
almost
down to
hour on hour, yeah.
Yeah, like look, I drive you mad, but we can look through that and still be friends at the end of the day. Or maybe that's just my bias. Maybe you hate me and you tell Ash, your girlfriend at home, what a drama queen I am.
It's a blind spot, sure.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the point is that my 2 biggest biases that play out are definitely expedience bias, which is a big driver for me. It's around, you know, moving things swiftly along and wanting to draw them to or bring them to completion. And typically what's happened is when I've made expedient decisions is that I haven't often painted the complete picture. And I haven't maybe evaluated all the information that's at my disposal and thought through the implications of that, particularly in high stakes examples. And the second example where my bias plays out a lot is my experience bias. And that's because, you know, being in consulting for over 10 or 12, almost 12 years now, I feel like I have a decent gauge and a decent understanding of, you know, the things I've done in the past. And typically I use my experience to inform my decision. And more often than not, that experience is just my lens of the world. And it's not often the right way. And I should more often than not be taking on other people's perspectives. Because typically experience bias happens anytime we fail to appreciate the way we see things in our lens rather than the way they actually are. And I think those 2 are examples, but I mean, what would be interesting to hear your perspective, what biases typically play out in yours and whether you have some stories.
Yeah, I have that great story that we were talking about a bit earlier in the week that I'll get to, but I'll just also comment on what you were saying there around experience biases. We often see the world as we are, not as it is. And you know, there's a lot of things around being positive, being grateful, and you know, and receiving gratitude because you see it. And people that are more risk averse, people that are more averse to positivity are not going to see the positivity in things as well. And that's something worth really worth highlighting as well, is we see the world as it is, and you always want to sense check, is my perception of reality accurate? Would another person say the same thing about this decision? So the example I want to give is a very interesting one. It's very close to our team and my heart as well. And it actually came when we were developing our website about a year ago. So at that stage, we had hired what was a marketing intern, first real job. He's now one of our star performers in our marketing team. But at that time, it was a bit green around the ears. First role, still learning a lot, business writing, still improving, but a really great asset on the team and one of the best learners we've ever had. I wish I was like him at his age. I think we all do. But when we were looking at providers to redesign our website, I went through a process, right? Almost like a tender process to write the specs, get different providers. And I got the guy that did the website previously. I got another person that was recommended and one more in the mix to kind of write it off. And then he said to me, this young marketing intern, he's like, well, I once did some vacation work at Clover, and there was this marketing company we used that did the TV commercials for Clover. They would be good for the website. And I'm busy, I'm rushed. I do a lot of things in the business besides brand and strategy and actually the science of the business. And I was like, we don't have time for this, honestly. And in my mind, if I'm being honest, I was like, what do you know? You've been exposed to work for about a minute. You think this TV company who's a digital agency, which whoever's a digital agency is going to work. And then a week passes and he says to me, Rob, should I reach out to them? I know you said no. Should I reach out to them? And he is tenacious. I give him that. That's why we've kept him on and he's been doing so well. And I said, you know what, Rob, to myself, is bias playing out here? And when I looked at it, it definitely was. I had my experience of the world. I also discounted his experience and the opportunity that was there as well. It comes from another saying where people say, don't not like an idea because you don't like the source of it. And I thought, maybe there's a blind spot here. Maybe there's some bias playing out. And maybe my first gut reaction is not accurate. So I said, what the hell? Let's get the provider in. We went to tender. And in the end, that provider won. They developed our best website yet for the Neuro Leadership Institute here in South Africa. And it was a huge blind spot that we were actively able to mitigate in my own personal biases. And the real story out of that, I think that really brings it home, if you start talking about takeaways, is really to sense check your first thought that goes in the head when you're making when you're making a decision. Is bias playing out? Do you need a different perspective? Or are you just taking the first answer in the top mental filing cabinet drawer? You know, another great way that I always test this is I ask my partner at home. I ask her for her opinion. She has no experience of leadership development, which always becomes an interesting conversation. But then she also has none of the biases that I do. And it's so enlightening to talk to other people outside of your context and industry and get their perspective, especially when making a big decision. So I think if I want to leave the audience with something that they can start practicing with, it's really to ask them to sense check. Are you trusting your gut? Are you only going with your gut as your first thought? And how are you involving other people's decision making into the decisions that matter the most for you? Those are some of the things I've been working on. I think that really relate to some to that story as well. Rob, I know you wanted to mention a little bit more around bias or perhaps some of the experimenting. What's top of mind?
Yeah, I love those two examples, Rob. I think bringing in different perspectives and trying to, as you mentioned earlier, experiment in the smaller stakes decisions you make and catch where your biases maybe don't serve you are two great tips. The one thing that I found really interesting through a program we used to run 2 or 3 years ago, which focused intently on decision making, was a book that's really, really insightful around decision making. It's called Descartes' Error. And it speaks to some of the research around the importance of also acknowledging emotions when you make decisions. And I don't want to go down it for too long because there's a lot to that book. But essentially, Descartes proclaimed that I think, therefore I am. And he was a thought leader around the fact that what he had been exposed to in his research suggested that our brains our emotions have no impact, should I say, on the decisions we make from a neurological standpoint. And what came out through later research through one of the world's leading neurologists, a guy called Antonio Damasio, was that he found and disproved that error, what is called now in the book Descartes' Error, that emotions have a vital role to play in decision making, and that they are interrelated and interdependent. And I know when I'm emotionally riled or I have emotions playing out that I'm more inclined to make a biased decision. And we spoke about in one of our previous episodes that when the brain's under tremendous threat, and whatever that threat may be, your brain becomes a hotbed for bias. And I think that's key to make mention of, is when you're trying to figure out how you mitigate biases when they don't serve you, is try to acknowledge what emotions are playing out with you and maybe pushing you to make more of a biased decision. Because I think that's one of my tips. Is I'm an emotionally volatile guy. I can be gung ho and happy and jovial, and in the next minute I think I can get really down and be frustrated and angered quite quickly. And that's when I need to be cognizant of not necessarily making high stakes decisions, or, as we've said, acknowledging different viewpoints. And there's so much research around what happens in the brain, your prefrontal cortex, when making decisions, and how you make optimal decisions, and making sure that sometimes your emotion does enable you to make a better decision, but you need to be conscious of the emotions playing out.
Sure, I think, yeah, and this topic is so big that we can have a series of episodes just on it. But the role of emotions is so powerful. I mean, with regards to the global pandemic, there were a lot of people that were with an override of emotions over a sustained period of time. People were talking about pandemic fatigue or brain fog, and essentially, our brain is more likely to make more biased decisions, more cognitively easy decisions, or more mental shortcuts when you're emotional. When you're emotional, you don't have access to your best thinking. That's why you make these rash decisions. That's why you make the most obvious choice, the most playing to similarity bias, expedience bias, safety bias, all these biases that play out become a hotbed when we feel emotional. And we have to understand the role of emotions in it, and that some ways emotions can override our decision making, that in other ways they can inform it as well, because emotions are not just something that becomes us, we become emotional. Emotions are also directives. They are responses to something, a stimulus. It's a real example of the mind-body connection. And I think, that also is another topic we can get to in a while. But I think one of the big things, and we talked about it earlier, is that when you are feeling emotional, when you are, you get that tough mail from the boss and you open up Outlook and you're like, well, now they're going to have it. Let me get into this one. Sure, type it out, do your stuff, but then sleep on it. Sleep on it and see how you feel the next day. And it's almost like two different people wrote those mails, and the one that you eventually send off once you've slept on it as well. And another great way, another real superpower to start doing that is when you have a very tough decision, try and see if you can break the decision up into chunks. Do we have to decide everything today? Or can you create spacing between the decisions, or separate smaller decisions in the big one as well? That's another real great example to try and create that space, because looming deadlines always create the emotions around that are going to lead to more biased decision making as well.
Yeah, and agreed. I think I think we should make reference and link back to our previous episode, which was episode 4 on innovation as a future power skill. And we spoke about in that episode some of the power skills that are most kind of revered and most desired right now in organizations is innovation and critical thinking. And I think decision making and mitigating bias when it doesn't serve you links closely to critical thinking. So to our listeners, if you haven't listened to episode 4, we've tried to link them up. There's some level of coherence and synergy between the two, but be conscious of those tips that Rob's mentioned, and really focus intently on how you manage those biases where they don't necessarily serve you.
And I think in conclusion, I mean, that's really what the learning zone is about. Trying to create those practical tips that we can use every day in the low stakes environments, so that when we get to the high stakes environments, we can perform at our best. As always, I've been Rob, joined by Rob. Thank you for listening to our 5th episode, and we look forward to carrying on the journey both on Instagram, LinkedIn, and where all good podcasts are listened to.
Ciao, everyone.